Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Imagine this. It's late at night and you stumble across an old photograph at a yard sale. The picture is cracked and faded, but the faces stare back at you with an intensity that feels wrong. Their eyes are too close, their jaws too narrow, their bodies too frail. Written in shaky handwriting across the back are 5 words. He shared a bed with his sister. Suddenly you realize this isn't just a random family snapshot. It's a clue to a story the world was never supposed to hear. For nearly a century, a hidden bloodline lived in the shadows of rural America, their lives woven together in ways most of us cannot imagine and would rather not. They were farmers, churchgoers, and neighbors. But behind the walls of their wooden farmhouse, the truth was far darker. Sons and daughters born from mothers who were also aunts, brothers who were also fathers, and a young boy who grew up believing it was normal to share his bed with the sister who would one day bear his child. The legacy they left behind is not preserved in history books nor spoken about in polite company. Yet it lingers in whispers, in towns where old folks warn children not to wander too far into the woods, where the ruins of a collapsed barn still stand, and where gravestones mark names repeated again and again across generations. Each stone, each name, is a clue in a puzzle that reveals just how deep the roots of this inbred legacy reached. Tonight, we're going to peel back those layers, not with mockery, not with cruelty, but with the cold eye of history. Because this is not just the story of one family, it's the story of a silence that America has carried for decades, and once you hear it, you won't be able to forget it. What drove them to live this way? Was it isolation, poverty, or was it something darker? An obsession with blood, a desire to keep their world closed, even if it meant destroying the lives of their children. The answers, as you'll soon discover, are buried in chilling detail. The story begins, as many of these forgotten histories do, with land, acres of unforgiving soil carved out of the Appalachian foothills by a family that carried the same name for generations. To the neighbors, they were quiet, hard-working, maybe a little strange, but strangeness was common in places where the nearest town doctor was a day's ride away and winters lasted too long. What set them apart was not what outsiders saw, but what was kept hidden behind their doors. Census records from the late 1800s list the family members in confusing patterns. A child born to a woman who was already too old to carry, another infant whose birth date doesn't line up with the parents listed on paper, and surnames repeated again and again as though no new blood ever entered. What began as cousins marrying cousins quietly shifted into something more, fathers pairing with daughters, brothers with sisters. It was no accident. It was a choice. Those who lived nearby spoke in hushed tones about screams echoing across the valley at night, though no one dared investigate. To them, it was easier to turn away. Poverty made people desperate, and in isolated places, morality bent until it broke. The family became a rumor, a cautionary tale, a name you didn't speak too loud in church. Children at school whispered that if you stared too long at one of them, they'd curse you. But beneath the whispers, the truth was more tragic than the rumors. The children born of this inbred legacy grew up fragile, some with twisted spines, others with eyes that never aligned, voices that trembled when they spoke, and yet within the walls of their home, they weren't seen as broken. They were simply family. It was all they had ever known. The boy who shared a bed with his sister didn't question it, because no one ever told him it was wrong. To him, it was just another way of surviving in a world that had long forgotten them. And so the cycle deepened. One generation folded into the next, each child carrying the marks of the bloodline, each marriage tightening the noose of heritage. By the time outsiders truly took notice, the damage was irreversible. What had started as whispers was now undeniable evidence etched into faces, bones, and bloodlines. But even then, the family did not stop. If anything, secrecy only made them cling tighter to each other, bound by both shame and necessity. They were no longer just living in isolation. They were building a legacy that would one day horrify the world. To understand how this legacy could take root and endure, you have to step into their world. Imagine the turn of the 20th century, dirt roads that turned to mud with the first rainfall, a single church that served as both spiritual refuge and community gathering, and a family so entangled in its own secrecy that outsiders might as well have been from another planet. The boy at the center of this story was born into such a household. His name has been buried by history, perhaps on purpose, but what we know is chilling. From the moment he could walk, he was taught that family was everything, and that family was all he would ever have. His father was also his uncle, his mother also his aunt. Bloodlines circled in on themselves until there was nowhere else to turn. When he reached adolescence, the walls of that farmhouse became his entire universe. There were no dances, no courting, no outside friendships. The only companion he was ever allowed to grow close to was his sister. At first it was innocent, two children playing in the yard, sharing secrets, whispering into the night. But as they grew older, that bond deepened into something their parents did not discourage. In fact, it was expected. The bed they shared was not a mistake, not a secret shame, but part of the unspoken rules of the household. Records suggest that by the time he was 16, his sister was already carrying his child. Neighbors caught glimpses of her swollen belly, though no man was ever seen calling at their door. When questions arose, the family dismissed them with a coldness that sent shivers down the spines of those who dared pry, and soon the whispers became louder. He shares a bed with his sister. But here is the most unsettling part. He did not resist it. For him, there was no concept of another way of life. To leave the farm was unthinkable, to love outside the family impossible. He grew up believing that this was not only normal, but destiny. And with each child born from that union, the cycle cemented itself deeper into the soil of their land, like roots twisting around old bones. The family had become a self-contained world, locked in by geography, poverty, and a silence that no one dared break. But silence, as history has shown us, is never eternal. Silence only lasts until someone decides to speak, and in this case, it was the land itself that began to betray the family. Neighbors started noticing things they could no longer ignore. Children with eyes that didn't align, voices that echoed with strange tones, bodies frail and bent long before old age. The children of the boy and his sister bore the unmistakable stamp of generations folding in upon themselves. Doctors rarely came this far out into the hills, but when they did, they left unsettled. Notes scribbled in faded journals describe unusual deformities and peculiar family structures, but none dared write down the truth outright. It was easier, even for professionals, to leave things unsaid. To name it would have been to admit that something monstrous was happening in their own backyard. Yet for the family there was no sense of monstrosity. To them, blood was sacred. It was the thread that bound them, the shield that kept outsiders from corrupting their way of life. Sharing a bed with a sister wasn't an act of rebellion or sin. It was duty, a continuation of something started long before they were born. And the boy, now a man, believed in that duty with a chilling devotion. Generations deep, their family tree no longer spread outward. Instead, it twisted inward, curling back upon itself like a serpent devouring its own tail. Each new birth was both a continuation and a reminder of the prison they had built. Outsiders described their gatherings as strange. No laughter, no warmth, only a quiet, watchful intensity. Everyone was related, everyone was bound by the same unspoken law. We do not leave, we do not break the chain. Still, rumors spread beyond the valley. Travelers passing through whispered about strange figures glimpsed at dusk, about children with unsettling gazes watching from the edge of the trees. Parents told their own children not to wander near the family's land. And slowly, the once quiet legacy of secrecy became a living ghost story, a story of siblings who shared not only a bed, but a bloodline so tightly wound that it seemed impossible they could endure. And yet, they did endure. For decades, the cycle continued until the outside world finally began to close in, curious, horrified, unable to look away. By the middle of the 20th century, the family's story could no longer hide in whispers. Roads improved, towns expanded, and what was once an isolated corner of the hills became easier to reach. Outsiders began asking questions the locals had long avoided. Who lived in that crumbling farmhouse? Why did the children look so much alike, yet so unlike anyone else? And how was it that, generation after generation, the same names appeared on birth records, repeating like an echo? Journalists came, not many, and not often, but enough to leave fragments of the truth behind. Articles spoke carefully, dancing around the word incest, but the suggestion hung heavy between the lines. Families in neighboring counties denied knowing much, though in private they admitted what everyone suspected, that the siblings had continued their union for decades, producing children who grew up to do the same. The man who once shared a bed with his sister had become a patriarch by then. His children called him father and uncle in the same breath. And when the cycle repeated, he called himself grandfather to babies who were, by blood, much closer than that. Each new birth deepened the labyrinth of relations until no one outside the family could map it, and no one inside dared try. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have walked away, or would you have been pulled into the same dark current that trapped them all? Because here is the truth most people cannot face. Escape was nearly impossible. Poverty bound them, shame bound them, and the longer the cycle went on, the more fragile the children became, physically and mentally, leaving them unprepared to leave, unprepared to survive beyond the valley. They were trapped not just by their family, but by the very legacy carved into their blood. And so the man who first shared his sister's bed died an old man, his legacy still alive in the faces of children who looked startlingly like him. His story didn't end with his death. It echoed forward, carried in whispers, in rumors, in the unmarked graves that dotted the family's land. What he began became a curse no one could lift. But curses, as history shows, never remain buried forever. The curse finally surfaced when outsiders could no longer deny what they were seeing. Social workers, teachers, and law enforcement began to intersect with the family in ways that forced the truth into the open. A child would arrive at school barely able to speak, another would collapse from an illness no doctor could trace, and soon authorities began to piece together what the valley had tried to bury. But even when confronted, the family clung to their silence. Interviews from the time described them as guarded, distrustful, speaking in fragments that revealed nothing. When asked about the father of a child, answers shifted. Sometimes he was away, sometimes dead, and sometimes chillingly, "You wouldn't understand." They were right. Most people couldn't. And yet when officials drew family trees, the lines doubled back on themselves like tangled roots. Siblings became spouses, fathers and uncles became the same person, and entire branches looped until no clear beginning or end remained. For many who studied it, the pattern was less a tree than a circle, a closed world, feeding on itself. Historians looking back describe it as one of America's most disturbing family legacies, not because of its rarity, but because of how long it remained hidden. A secret kept not just by the family, but by an entire community that chose silence over confrontation. The boy who had once lain beside his sister had become a ghost in the official record, yet his shadow stretched forward through generations. What haunted investigators most wasn't only the physical deformities or the tangled lineage, but the eerie normalcy with which the family lived it. There was no sense of rebellion, no attempt to justify or excuse. It was simply life, a closed loop where children were raised to accept what their parents had accepted before them. And so the story survived, buried, whispered, distorted, teared but never gone. It slipped into folklore, into hushed warnings, into half-remembered articles yellowing in archives. And today it lingers in the same haunting way, a reminder that some legacies are not written in books, but in blood. The question remains, what does it mean to inherit such a past? Can a family ever break free from a curse this deep, or does it echo forever, passed down in silence, shame, and bone? Every legacy eventually reaches its end. The boy who once shared his sister's bed grew old, his body bent and broken by the same forces that had shaped his children. When he died, the family gathered in the same yard where he had once played as a child, burying him beneath a crude wooden marker. To outsiders, it was the death of just another poor farmer. To those who knew the whispers, it was the closing of a chapter that had haunted the valley for more than half a century. But death does not erase memory. His children carried the weight of his choices, and their children carried it still. The bloodline did not vanish overnight. Instead, it slowly unraveled, scattered by marriage, migration, and the inevitable march of time. Yet in every generation, there remained traces, faces too alike, eyes that carried the unmistakable look of the family, voices that trembled as though carrying echoes of the past. What makes this story endure is not simply the horror of what happened within those walls, but the silence that surrounded it. An entire community chose to look away, to let the cycle turn again and again. They allowed the boy and his sister to believe their union was not only acceptable but inevitable, and by the time the world forced itself to look, the damage was irreversible. Today the farmhouse has collapsed, its wooden beams rotting beneath vines and moss. Travelers pass by without knowing what once happened there, but those who stop, those who step onto the land, say they feel it. A heaviness, a stillness, as though the ground itself remembers. And perhaps it does. For legacies like this are not confined to history books. They linger in folklore, in stories whispered to children around campfires, in the uneasy knowledge that somewhere, even now, there are families living in silence, repeating patterns no one dares to name. The boy and his sister are long gone, but their story survives, uncomfortable, haunting, unforgettable. A reminder that some truths are too dark to erase, and some legacies too twisted to forget. So the next time you stumble across an old photograph, faded and cracked, with faces staring back at you through time, ask yourself what story it carries. Because sometimes, behind even the most ordinary image, lies a secret like this one, a secret that was never meant to be seen.